close your eyes now and feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort. Your breathing slows, becoming rhythmic and peaceful, like waves gently lapping against a distant shore. The world around you fades into a soft, welcoming darkness, and your mind begins to drift into that sacred space between waking and sleeping. Here, in this tranquil realm, stories unfold like dreams, wrapping around your consciousness with the gentleness of silk. Tonight, we explore one of humanity's oldest and most fascinating relationships, a dance between danger and salvation that has shaped our history, our medicine, and our understanding of life itself. Let the tension release from your shoulders. Feel your jaw relax, and allow yourself to float freely as we journey together through the intricate, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying science of poison and antidotes. You are safe here, perfectly at ease, ready to absorb these stories that have echoed through millennia. The story of poisons begins not in laboratories or medieval apothecaries, but in the primordial forests and savannas, where our earliest ancestors first learned to hunt and survive. Long before written language, before the first civilizations rose from the dust, humans discovered that certain plants, certain creatures, possessed a power that transcended the physical, a power that could end life with invisible swiftness. Picture, if you will, the scene. A small band of early humans, perhaps 50,000 years ago, tracking prey through dense vegetation. They have spears, yes, crude, but effective weapons tipped with sharpened stone. But bringing down large game requires getting dangerously close, and many hunts end in injury or death for the hunters themselves. Then, one day, someone makes a discovery that changes everything. Perhaps it happens by accident. A hunter cuts himself while gathering materials near a particular plant, and the wound feels strange, begins to tingle, and then goes numb. Or maybe a member of the tribe observes how animals that feed on certain berries or leaves sicken and die, their bodies convulsing in ways that suggest invisible forces at work. However it happens, the realization dawns. Nature has provided weapons beyond what can be seen or touched. These substances, when applied to arrow tips or spear points, allow hunters to bring down prey from a safe distance, the poison doing work that muscles and stone alone could never accomplish. Archaeological evidence reveals grooves carved into ancient hunting weapons, channels specifically designed to hold poisonous substances. These weren't merely functional modifications. They represented a profound shift in human capability, the first chemical warfare, if you will. The knowledge of poisons became sacred, powerful, often restricted to shamans, elders, and those of high rank within tribal structures. There was something almost supernatural about these substances, the way they could kill without visible injury, how a tiny amount could fell a creature many times the size of a human. In some cultures, this knowledge became intertwined with beliefs about spirits, magic, and the unseen world. The poisoner held a special place in society, someone who understood secrets that others could not fathom, someone who wielded death itself. This mystical quality never entirely disappeared from our relationship with poisons. Even today, there remains something uniquely unsettling about death by poison, something that feels more sinister, more calculated than other forms of violence. It is the invisible killer, the betrayer that hides in food and drink, in the very sustenance we need to survive. As human societies evolved and coalesced into the first great civilizations, the knowledge of poisons became systematized, studied, and unfortunately, weaponized in new and terrible ways. The ancient Egyptians, those master chemists who could preserve bodies for eternity, also possessed deep understanding of toxic substances. The earliest known Egyptian pharaoh, Menes, who ruled around 3,000 years before the Common Era, studied the properties of poisonous plants and venoms with scientific rigor unusual for his time. Papyri from ancient Egypt reveal knowledge of copper, crude arsenic, lead, opium, and mandrake, all substances that could heal in small doses but kill in larger amounts. The Egyptians understood something fundamental that modern pharmacology would later codify. The dose makes the poison. In ancient India, the development of Ayurvedic medicine brought with it sophisticated understanding of toxic substances and their antidotes. Between 350 and 283 years before the Common Era, a brilliant advisor named Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, served as prime minister to the first Maurya emperor. In his writings, he advocated for the use of poisons in political strategy, suggesting that seduction, secret weapons, and toxins could all serve the interests of the state. This wasn't mere theoretical musing. Records indicate that poisoned weapons were used extensively in ancient Indian warfare, and that wells were deliberately contaminated to poison enemy populations. But alongside this dark application, Indian physicians like Sushruta developed detailed classifications of poisons, described the stages of slow poisoning, and most importantly, researched antidotes using traditional substances. They understood that for every poison, nature might provide a cure, a belief that would echo through centuries of medical practice. China's relationship with poisons proved equally complex and sophisticated. The concept of du, which encompassed both poison and medicine, became central to Chinese pharmacology. This wasn't a contradiction, but rather a recognition of fundamental truth. Substances exist along a spectrum, beneficial or harmful, depending on quantity, preparation, and application. Chinese physicians incorporated poisons like cinnabar, a mercury compound, aconite, a highly poisonous herb, bezoar stones from ox gallstones, and even cannabis into their healing repertoire. The legendary figure Shen Nung, considered the father of Chinese herbal medicine, supposedly tested hundreds of herbs on himself to understand their properties. According to legend, he sampled 365 different herbs before finally succumbing to an overdose. His sacrifice, whether historical fact or mythologized tale, represented the dangerous pursuit of knowledge that characterized early toxicology. Around 300 years before the Common Era, something remarkable happened almost simultaneously across distant civilizations. In Egypt, the alchemist Agatha Demon mixed an unknown mineral with natron, a naturally occurring salt, and produced what modern researchers believe was arsenic trioxide, a poison so deadly it could dissolve in water and leave barely a trace. In India, as we've discussed, Kautilya advised on strategic poisoning. In China, the development of sophisticated poison detection and antidote protocols accelerated. It's as though humanity collectively reached a threshold in its understanding of chemistry and biology, where the systematic study of poisons became possible, even necessary. This period marked the transition from accidental or observational knowledge to deliberate experimentation, and application. The ancient Greeks contributed their own chapters to this dark history. Greek physicians and philosophers discussed poisons with the analytical precision that characterized their approach to all natural phenomena. They understood that certain substances affected the body's humors, that balance could be disrupted by external agents, and that death could come through mechanisms invisible to the eye. The most famous poisoning in ancient Greece, perhaps in all of ancient history, was an execution of Socrates in 399 years before the Common Era. The 70-year-old philosopher, convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods, was sentenced to death by hemlock. Plato's account in the Phaedo describes Socrates drinking the poison calmly, taking a few steps, then reporting that his legs felt heavy. He lay down and described coldness rising from his feet, a gradual loss of sensation as the poison paralyzed his nervous system. He remained conscious until near the end, a characteristic of hemlock poisoning that makes it particularly cruel. The poison comes from water hemlock or poison hemlock plants, both containing neurotoxins that disrupt nerve signal transmission, eventually paralyzing the muscles that control breathing. Socrates' death became symbolic, a martyrdom that demonstrated both the power of poisons and the power of philosophy in the face of death. But it was Rome, that great empire that dominated the ancient Mediterranean world, where poisoning reached epidemic proportions. From the 1st century before the Common Era onward, individual cases of poisoning increased dramatically, reaching a peak during the reign of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Political intrigue, ambition, and the concentration of power in imperial families created an environment where poison became a tool of statecraft. Emperors, senators, wealthy merchants, and their families lived in constant fear of the poisoned cup, the tainted meal. 6 Roman emperors met their end through poisoning, including Claudius, whose wife Agrippina poisoned him to advance her son Nero to the throne. Nero, in turn, is believed to have poisoned his stepbrother Britannicus and attempted to poison his own mother. Though Agrippina had practiced Mithridatism, the regular ingestion of small amounts of poison to build immunity, and survived the attempt, Nero eventually had her killed by other means. The sophistication of Roman poisoning extended to the poisons themselves. Vegetable poisons were most commonly used and included plants with belladonna alkaloids like henbane, datura, deadly nightshade, and mandrake. Aconite from monkshood, hemlock, hellebore, and yew extract all found their way into the poisoner's arsenal. These weren't crude preparations, but carefully extracted and concentrated substances. Professional poisoners, often women, tested their mixtures on slaves and condemned criminals, refining dosages to ensure effectiveness, while sometimes attempting to make the poisoning appear natural. The most infamous trio of female poisoners, Canidia, Martina, and Locusta, became legendary for their skills. Locusta particularly found employment under Emperor Nero, who used her services repeatedly to eliminate rivals and family members. Roman knowledge of poisons came from the writings of physicians and naturalists like Dioscorides, Scribonius Largus, Nicander, Pliny the Elder, and Galen. These texts, passed down through centuries, became the foundation for medieval and Renaissance understanding of toxicology. They described not just the poisons themselves, but also their symptoms, methods of detection, and when possible, antidotes. The Romans understood that mineral poisons like salts of lead, Mercury, copper, arsenic, and antimony existed, though they rarely used them for poisoning, perhaps because their effects were too obvious or too difficult to disguise. Animal poisons remained poorly understood, though venomous snakes, spiders, and scorpions were recognized as dangerous. Interestingly, some supposed poisons like bull's blood and the secretions of toads and salamanders were entirely ineffective, based more on superstition than chemical reality. What's striking about this ancient period is not just the prevalence of poisoning, but the sophisticated understanding that accompanied it. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated applications of chemical knowledge. The ancients recognized that different poisons worked through different mechanisms, that some killed quickly, while others caused lingering death, that some could be detected and others left no trace. They understood synergy, how combining multiple toxic substances could enhance effects or make detection more difficult. This knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years, represented a dark form of scientific progress, humanity learning to manipulate the chemical foundations of life itself. The fear of poisoning in ancient Rome led to elaborate precautions. Food tasters became common in imperial households and among the wealthy. Antidotes, both real and imagined, were sought desperately. Special stones and gems were believed to protect against poisons. Amulets and charms proliferated. But one man took the pursuit of protection further than anyone before or since, and his story deserves its own telling. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, ruled over a region along the Black Sea from approximately 132 to 63 years before the Common Era. He came to power through bloodshed and betrayal. His father had been poisoned by enemies, and the young Mithridates had good reason to fear his own mother would dispatch him similarly to consolidate her power. Instead of succumbing to paranoia alone, Mithridates transformed his fear into obsessive scientific inquiry. He became history's first experimental toxicologist, a man so driven to understand and defeat poisons that he would become synonymous with the very concept of building immunity through controlled exposure. Mithridates was no mere frightened monarch hiding behind food tasters. Historical accounts describe him as highly educated and sophisticated, fluent in 22 languages, a man who appreciated art, philosophy, and science. But above all else, he was obsessed with poisons and their antidotes. He established what might be called the first imperial toxicology department, employing the best doctors and natural scientists of his day. He recruited experts from across the known world, luring famous physicians from as far as Rome with promises of wealth and prestige. His purpose was singular: to understand every poison, to test every potential antidote, to make himself invulnerable to the weapon that had killed his father. His methods would be considered horrifically unethical today. Mithridates experimented on prisoners and condemned criminals, administering various toxins and then testing proposed antidotes. He kept meticulous records of symptoms, progression, and outcomes. This wasn't casual cruelty, but systematic research, building what modern scientists would call a database of dose-response relationships. He studied venoms from the most deadly snakes of his region, the toxic secretions of spiders and scorpions, plant-based poisons from across the known world. Each substance was cataloged, its effects observed and recorded, its interactions with other substances noted. Through this grim research, a body of proven knowledge emerged, information that several ancient sources attest to, though sadly, no complete medical records survive today. But Mithridates went beyond merely observing the effects of poisons on others. He practiced what would later be called Mithridatism, the regular ingestion of gradually increasing doses of poison to build resistance. Every day, Mithridates would consume small amounts of various toxic substances, carefully measured and prepared by his physicians. The theory, which modern science has partially validated, is that the body can develop certain defenses against toxins through repeated exposure. Some toxins trigger the production of antibodies or metabolic enzymes that can neutralize them. Others may cause cellular changes that make tissues less susceptible to damage. The effectiveness of this approach varies greatly depending on the specific substance. It works reasonably well for some plant toxins and venoms, but provides little protection against many mineral poisons. According to legend, Mithridates eventually developed remarkable resistance to numerous poisons. Stories circulated of assassination attempts that failed because the toxins had no effect on him. Whether these tales were exaggerated or based in truth, they enhanced his reputation as a man who had conquered death itself. He became a figure of both admiration and fear, a king who wielded power not just through armies, but through secret knowledge. The culmination of Mithridates' research was a formula that combined small portions of dozens of the best-known herbal remedies of his time. This universal antidote, which he named Mithridatium after himself, contained perhaps 50 or more ingredients, each selected for its supposed protective or curative properties. The exact formula remained a closely guarded secret during his lifetime, known only to his most trusted physicians and perhaps members of his family. The antidote wasn't simply a collection of random herbs, but a carefully balanced composition based on years of experimentation and observation. Some ingredients likely had genuine pharmaceutical activity, while others may have been included based on magical or symbolic reasoning. The complexity itself was part of the formula's perceived power. Surely something with so many components, so difficult to prepare, must be effective. The irony of Mithridates' story comes at its end. After a long reign marked by wars against Rome, the king finally faced defeat at the hands of Pompey the Great. Finding himself trapped, his kingdom lost, Mithridates decided to end his life by poison rather than face capture and humiliation. He reportedly took what he believed to be a fatal dose of poison. But nothing happened. His years of Mithridatism, his daily consumption of toxins, had made him immune to the very method of death he chose. Unable to poison himself successfully, he asked a loyal servant to kill him with the sword. The man who had spent his entire life preparing to survive poisoning died instead by the blade, a twisted culmination of his life's work. Yet Mithridates' legacy didn't die with him. When Pompey conquered Pontus, he seized the king's papers, including detailed notes on poisons, antidotes, and the formula for Mithridatium. These documents were taken back to Rome, where they became the foundation for centuries of antidote development. Roman physicians studied them, refined them, and created their own versions of the universal antidote. Pliny the Elder wrote about these formulations, preserving knowledge that would survive the fall of Rome itself. Several centuries after Mithridates, another famous antidote emerged, one that would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years. Andromachus, physician to Emperor Nero, developed an improved version of the universal antidote, which he called theriac or theriaca. The name came from the Greek word theia, meaning wild beasts, because the original formula was meant to protect against venomous animal bites. But like Mithridatium, theriac's claimed powers expanded to encompass protection against all poisons and eventually to become a cure-all for numerous diseases. Andromachus's theriac was even more complex than Mithridates' formula, containing 64 ingredients. The most significant and unusual ingredient was the flesh of vipers, which were believed to have special properties that could neutralize other venoms. The preparation process itself was elaborate, taking months and involving precise timing and temperatures. The physician Galen, whose medical theories would dominate Western medicine for over a millennium, championed theriac enthusiastically. He wrote an entire book on the subject, detailing its preparation, uses, and remarkable powers. According to Galen, theriac could cure everything from snake bites to plague, from poisoning to epilepsy. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whom Galen served as personal physician, took theriac every day, varying the dosage according to his needs and perceived threats. His habit popularized the antidote among wealthy Romans, who saw it as both protective medicine and status symbol. If the emperor trusted theriac with his life, surely it must be effective. The problem, of course, is that theriac was mostly useless. Some of its herbal components may have had mild pharmaceutical effects, and the opium it often contained certainly provided pain relief and induced pleasant sensations that could be mistaken for healing. But as a universal antidote, as a cure-all, theriac was pure placebo, effective only through the power of belief. Yet this didn't diminish its popularity. Throughout medieval Europe, theriac remained the most prestigious medication, stored in ornate jars, prescribed by the most respected physicians, and sold at prices that only the wealthy could afford. Cities like Venice became famous for their theriac production, with public demonstrations of its preparation to assure buyers of its authenticity. The formula became increasingly elaborate, with some versions containing over 100 ingredients sourced from across the known world. The persistence of theriac for so many centuries reveals something important about human psychology and the history of medicine. We desperately want to believe that solutions exist for terrible problems, that safety can be purchased or prepared, that death can be held at bay through knowledge and ritual. Theriac embodied these hopes. Its complexity made it seem powerful, its expense made it seem valuable, and its history connected it to legendary figures like Mithridates and great physicians like Galen. Even as scientific medicine began to emerge during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, theriac persisted. It wasn't fully discredited and removed from pharmacopoeias until the 19th century. A remarkable run for a medication that was essentially ineffective. Medieval Europe's relationship with poisons existed in a strange twilight zone between the rationality inherited from classical texts and the superstition that characterized the era. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, scientific progress largely stalled in Europe for several centuries. The careful observations and systematic approaches of Roman physicians gave way to beliefs in magic, demons, and divine punishment. Poisons became associated with witchcraft and sorcery. The poisoner wasn't seen merely as a criminal, but as someone who had trafficked with evil forces, who had learned forbidden knowledge that violated natural and divine law. Yet knowledge of actual poisons continued to circulate and evolve. Monks in monasteries, some of the few literate people in early medieval Europe, copied ancient Greek and Roman texts on medicine and pharmacy, preserving knowledge even if they didn't advance it. Herbalists, often women working outside official channels, maintained traditions of plant lore, knowing which herbs healed and which killed. The line between healer and poisoner could be thin indeed. The same old woman who might help with a difficult birth or prepare a poultice for wounds could also know which mushrooms cause death, which plants induced visions or paralysis. The Islamic world, meanwhile, saw scientific flourishing while Europe languished. Building on the texts of Greek philosophers and the observations of physicians like Galen, Islamic scientists and doctors experimented with poisons and antidotes, writing influential texts that greatly advanced toxicology. They understood chemical principles that Europe wouldn't rediscover for centuries. Their work on distillation, crystallization, and purification led to more refined toxic substances and more effective medicines. These advances eventually filtered back into Europe during the later medieval period and the Renaissance, carried by traders, travelers, and scholars who had access to Arabic texts. The 13th century saw increased contact between Islamic and Christian scholarly traditions, and European medicine began to revive. However, fear of poisoning, if anything, intensified. The Black Death and other plagues that swept through Europe created an atmosphere of dread and suspicion. When people died mysteriously or in large numbers, poisoning was often suspected. Jews, foreigners, lepers, and other marginalized groups were sometimes accused of poisoning wells, leading to horrific persecutions and massacres. These accusations almost always lacked any factual basis, but the fear was real enough, as was the suffering it caused. As we move forward in history toward the Renaissance and early modern period, we find poisoning becoming almost an art form among certain circles of European nobility. The Borgia family, particularly Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, and his children Cesare and Lucrezia, gained lasting infamy for their alleged use of poisons to eliminate rivals and enemies. While some of the stories about the Borgias are likely exaggerated or fabricated by their enemies, there's no doubt that poisoning was rampant in Renaissance Italy among the powerful and ambitious. Arsenic became the poison of choice, earning the nickname inheritance powder for its frequent use in speeding along the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of figures like Paracelsus, who revolutionized thinking about poisons and medicines. Born in the late 15th century, Paracelsus challenged the ancient authorities, particularly Galen, and insisted on observation and experiment over received wisdom. His famous dictum, "The dose makes the poison," captured a fundamental truth that earlier physicians had understood intuitively but never articulated so clearly. All substances, Paracelsus argued, are potentially poisonous at high enough doses, and all can potentially be therapeutic at low doses. This insight laid the groundwork for modern pharmacology and toxicology. The recognition that the relationship between dose and effect is crucial to understanding any substance's impact on the body. The various poisons that have featured in human history each have their own characteristics, their own mechanisms of action. their own terrible poetry of destruction. To understand antidotes, we must first understand what they counteract. So let us examine some of these substances in detail. Arsenic, that favorite of poisoners from ancient Rome through the Victorian era, is a metalloid element found naturally in small amounts throughout the environment. It appears in air, water, soil, and even in some foods. Ancient peoples extracted arsenic from mines where it occurred alongside lead and iron ores. The most common poisonous form, arsenic trioxide, appears as a white powder that can dissolve in liquids, making it relatively easy to administer surreptitiously. It has little taste, though some people report a slight sweetness or metallic flavor. Arsenic kills by interfering with cellular metabolism at the most fundamental level. Inside every cell are tiny structures called mitochondria, often called the powerhouses of the cell, because they produce the energy molecule ATP that fuels all cellular processes. Arsenic disrupts enzymes in the mitochondria, essentially suffocating cells from within by preventing energy production. The body's most energy-dependent organs, the liver and kidneys, suffer first and most severely. Acute arsenic poisoning causes violent symptoms: severe gastric pain, vomiting, diarrhea often containing blood, dehydration, confusion, and eventually cardiovascular collapse and death. The victim essentially burns out from within, their cells unable to function as the machinery of life grinds to a halt. Chronic arsenic poisoning, from repeated small doses over time, presents differently. The victim may experience fatigue, weakness, frequent infections as the immune system struggles, skin changes including darkening, and the appearance of small corns or warts, and eventually organ damage, particularly to the liver and kidneys. One characteristic sign of chronic arsenic exposure is the appearance of white lines called Mises lines across the fingernails and toenails. These lines form as arsenic deposits in the nail matrix, and since nails grow slowly, the lines provide a timeline of exposure. This feature has proven useful in investigating suspected poisoning cases, as arsenic remains in hair and nails for months or even years after exposure, allowing forensic detection long after the fact. For centuries, arsenic poisoning was extremely difficult to detect, which explained its popularity among poisoners. The symptoms mimicked cholera and other natural diseases. Before the development of reliable chemical tests, poisoners could kill with relative impunity. This changed in 1836 when British chemist James Marsh developed the first reliable test for detecting arsenic in organic matter. The Marsh test could detect even tiny amounts of arsenic in bodily tissues and remains. Its introduction marked a turning point in forensic toxicology and helped convict numerous poisoners who had previously escaped justice. Suddenly, the invisible poison could be made visible, its presence proven in a court of law. Cyanide operates through a completely different mechanism, but with equally devastating effect. Various cyanide compounds exist, including hydrogen cyanide gas and the crystalline solids potassium cyanide and sodium cyanide. All share the deadly cyanide ion in their chemical structure. Cyanide can be found naturally in surprising places. Over 500 plants contain cyanide compounds, including cassava root, flax seeds, bamboos, and the pits of fruits like cherries, peaches, apricots, and plums. In most cases, the amounts are too small to cause harm under normal circumstances, but improper preparation of cassava, a staple food in many tropical regions, has caused cyanide poisoning outbreaks. Cyanide's lethality comes from its affinity for iron. Inside mitochondria, an enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase contains iron atoms that are essential for the final step of cellular respiration, the process by which cells use oxygen to produce energy. Cyanide binds tightly to the iron in this enzyme, completely blocking its function. With cytochrome C oxidase disabled, cells cannot use oxygen even though it's present in the blood. The victim essentially suffocates at the cellular level, a condition called histotoxic hypoxia. The body's oxygen supply is adequate, but cells cannot access it. The heart and brain, being the most oxygen-dependent organs, fail first. Cyanide poisoning is brutally fast. A lethal dose, about 140 milligrams of potassium cyanide for an average adult, can kill within minutes. Symptoms begin almost immediately: headache, confusion, difficulty breathing, convulsions, and loss of consciousness. The victim may experience what's described as a feeling of impending doom, an overwhelming sense that something terrible is happening. Death follows quickly from respiratory and cardiac arrest. One characteristic sign, though not always present, is the smell of bitter almonds. Cyanide can give off this distinctive odor, but interestingly, not everyone can detect it. The ability to smell cyanide is genetically determined, with roughly 40% of people unable to detect the scent at all. Because cyanide prevents oxygen utilization, the blood of cyanide victims remains bright red with unused oxygen. This can give the skin and lips a characteristic pink or red color, rather than the blue-gray pallor typical of other forms of suffocation. Forensic pathologists look for this sign, along with other indicators, when investigating suspected cyanide deaths. The poison leaves other traces as well. A bloody froth may appear around the mouth and nose, and the smell of bitter almonds, for those who can detect it, may be present at autopsy. Cyanide has earned infamy not just for individual murders, but for mass killings. It was used in Nazi gas chambers during the Holocaust in the form of Zyklon B, pellets that released hydrogen cyanide gas when exposed to air. The People's Temple Massacre in Jonestown in 1978 involved cyanide-laced drinks that killed over 900 people. The 1982 Tylenol murders in Chicago, where someone tampered with over-the-counter pain medication by adding potassium cyanide, killed 7 people and led to complete redesign of pharmaceutical packaging to prevent tampering. These dark chapters in history demonstrate cyanide's terrible efficiency as a killing agent. Strychnine presents a completely different horror. Extracted from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, native to India and Southeast Asia, strychnine is one of the most violent poisons in terms of its effects on victims. Unlike arsenic or cyanide, which cause relatively passive deaths, strychnine poisoning is a nightmare of uncontrollable muscle contractions. The poison works by blocking inhibitory signals in the spinal cord. Normally, the neurotransmitter glycine helps prevent excessive nerve firing, keeping muscle contractions under control. Strychnine blocks glycine receptors, essentially removing the brakes from the nervous system. Without this inhibition, even minor stimuli cause massive, violent muscle contractions throughout the body. A victim of strychnine poisoning experiences what can only be described as torture. Within minutes of ingestion, muscle stiffness begins. Then come the convulsions, powerful spasms that arch the back, clench the jaw, and extend the limbs. The face contorts into a terrifying expression, the mouth pulled into a grotesque grin called rhesus sardonicus. These spasms are not like epileptic seizures. The victim remains fully conscious throughout, aware of every agonizing contraction. The convulsions come in waves, triggered by the slightest sound, touch, or even bright light. Each spasm is stronger than the last, the muscles contracting with such force that they can fracture bones or tear tendons. Eventually, the victim dies from exhaustion, from inability to breathe as respiratory muscles lock up, or from cardiac arrest. The entire process, from ingestion to death, typically takes between 10 and 20 minutes, though it can last up to an hour. Those 20 minutes represent unimaginable suffering. There is no antidote for strychnine poisoning. Treatment focuses on preventing the convulsions through heavy sedation and muscle relaxants, controlling symptoms until the body can metabolize and eliminate the poison. The victim must be kept in a dark, quiet environment, as even minor stimuli can trigger spasms. Despite modern medical care, strychnine poisoning remains extremely dangerous and difficult to survive if a significant dose has been ingested. Historically, before the development of intensive care medicine and effective sedatives, strychnine poisoning was almost universally fatal. Hemlock, the poison that killed Socrates, comes from plants in the genus Conium, particularly Conium maculatum, poison hemlock, or cicuta species, water hemlock. These plants contain alkaloids that interfere with nerve signal transmission, particularly affecting the neuromuscular junction, where nerves communicate with muscles. The poison causes progressive paralysis, beginning with the extremities and moving toward the center of the body. As Socrates described, the victim first feels heaviness and loss of sensation in the legs, then coldness spreading upward. Gradually, motor control disappears. Unlike strychnine, which causes violent contractions, hemlock causes flaccid paralysis. The muscles simply stop responding to nerve signals. The mind remains clear until near the end, an especially cruel aspect of hemlock poisoning. The victim is aware of their body gradually shutting down, of their breathing becoming more and more difficult, until, finally, the diaphragm and chest muscles stop working altogether, and death comes from respiratory failure. Ricin, derived from castor beans, is remarkable for its extreme toxicity. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can kill an adult. Ricin is a protein that disrupts cellular function at the ribosomal level, preventing cells from making the proteins they need to survive. It's particularly insidious because symptoms may not appear for several hours or even days after exposure, depending on the route of entry. If inhaled, ricin causes respiratory distress and eventual respiratory failure. If ingested, it causes severe gastrointestinal symptoms, followed by organ failure. There is no antidote for ricin poisoning. Treatment is purely supportive, maintaining body functions while the immune system attempts to neutralize the toxin and damaged tissues attempt to repair themselves. The famous case of Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov, who was assassinated in London in 1978 via a tiny pellet containing ricin fired into his thigh from a modified umbrella, demonstrates how weaponizable this poison can be. Aconite from the monkshood or wolfsbane plant was used by indigenous tribes worldwide as arrow poison and was so deadly that growing, It was forbidden in ancient Rome. It affects the heart and nervous system, causing cardiac arrhythmias, intense pain, and numbness. Medieval witches supposedly used aconite as an ingredient in flying ointments, the numbing and hallucinogenic properties perhaps creating sensations of flight. Like many plant toxins, aconite has found medical uses in extremely diluted forms in traditional Chinese medicine and homeopathy, though its use is controversial due to the narrow margin between therapeutic and toxic doses. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, contains alkaloids like atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. These substances block acetylcholine receptors throughout the body, causing a constellation of effects: dilated pupils, dry mouth, rapid heartbeat, hallucinations, delirium, and at high doses, seizures and death. Interestingly, the name belladonna means beautiful woman in Italian, referring to the Renaissance practice of using diluted extracts to dilate the pupils, which was considered attractive. This practice was dangerous and probably caused chronic poisoning in many women who used it regularly. Today, purified atropine is an essential medicine used to counteract certain types of poisoning and in various medical procedures. Another example of the fine line between poison and medicine. The key to understanding all these poisons and the basis for developing antidotes lies in a concept that Paracelsus articulated centuries ago: the dose makes the poison. Modern toxicology has quantified this relationship through careful experimentation and mathematical modeling. The dose-response relationship describes how the effect of a substance changes as the amount administered increases. For most substances, this relationship follows a predictable pattern. At very low doses, there may be no detectable effect. As the dose increases, effects begin to appear, initially mild but becoming more pronounced with each increment. Eventually, a dose is reached where the effect becomes severe or lethal. Toxicologists use specific measurements to characterize this relationship. The LD50, or lethal dose 50%, is the amount of a substance required to kill half of a test population, usually laboratory animals. If you were to give the LD50 dose to 100 mice, you would expect approximately 50 to die and 50 to survive. This measurement provides a standardized way to compare the acute toxicity of different substances. A lower LD50 indicates higher toxicity. Less substance is needed to cause death. For example, botulinum toxin, the most poisonous substance known, has an LD50 of about 1 nanogram per kilogram of body weight. Water, conversely, has an LD50 of more than 90 grams per kilogram, a difference of about 100 billion-fold, or 11 orders of magnitude. This incredible range demonstrates how varied substances can be in their toxicity. Similarly, the ED50, or effective dose 50%, measures the dose at which 50% of individuals show the desired therapeutic effect. For medications, we want the ED50 to be relatively low, meaning we can achieve the desired effect with a small dose. The relationship between LD50 and ED50 gives us the therapeutic index, one of the most important concepts in pharmacology and toxicology. The therapeutic index is calculated by dividing the LD50 by the ED50. A high therapeutic index means there's a wide margin between the dose that provides benefit and the dose that causes serious harm or death. Penicillin, for example, has a very high therapeutic index, which is why it's considered a very safe medication. you would need to take an enormous amount to risk death, far more than any therapeutic dose. Conversely, medications with low therapeutic indexes are much more dangerous and require careful monitoring. Lithium, used to treat bipolar disorder, has a relatively narrow therapeutic range. The dose that provides psychiatric benefit isn't far from the dose that causes serious toxicity. Patients taking lithium need regular blood tests to ensure they're in the therapeutic range and not approaching toxic levels. Warfarin, a blood thinner derived from rat poison, similarly requires careful monitoring because the difference between an effective dose and a dangerous dose is relatively small. Chemotherapy drugs generally have low therapeutic indexes. The doses that kill cancer cells are often close to doses that cause severe side effects or harm to healthy tissues. Understanding these concepts helps explain why antidotes work and why some poisonings are more treatable than others. An effective antidote essentially changes the dose-response curve, shifting it so that a dose that would normally be lethal becomes survivable. Antidotes can work through several mechanisms, and understanding these mechanisms represents one of the great achievements of modern pharmacology and toxicology. Let us explore these mechanisms in detail, for they reveal both the elegance of medical science and the resilience of the human body when given the right tools to fight back against chemical assault. The simplest conceptual antidote mechanism is direct neutralization or binding. The antidote physically combines with the poison, forming a stable, non-toxic compound that the body can safely eliminate. Chelation therapy for heavy metal poisoning exemplifies this approach. When someone is poisoned by lead, mercury, arsenic, or other heavy metals, chelating agents like EDTA, DMSA, or dimercaprol can be administered. These molecules have structures that allow them to grab onto metal ions, forming stable complexes. Once bound to the chelating agent, the metal ion becomes inactive, unable to interact with biological molecules and cause damage. The body can then excrete the chelator metal complex through urine or feces. Time is crucial with chelation therapy. The longer heavy metals remain in the body, the more they distribute into tissues and bones, where they're harder to reach and remove. Early administration of chelating agents can dramatically improve outcomes in heavy metal poisoning. Another direct binding approach involves antibodies, the immune system's natural poison fighters. Antivenom for snake bites works this way. When a venomous snake strikes, it injects a complex mixture of proteins, enzymes, and other molecules that can cause tissue destruction, interfere with blood clotting, damage nerves, or affect multiple organ systems. Antivenom contains antibodies specifically designed to recognize and bind to these venom components, neutralizing them before they can cause damage. The production of antivenom is a fascinating process that connects directly back to those ancient concepts of Mithridatism and Theriac, though with rigorous scientific methodology replacing superstition. To produce antivenom, venom is first collected from snakes through a process called milking. Trained handlers stimulate the snake's venom glands while safely collecting the drops of venom that are expressed. This venom is then carefully diluted to reduce its toxicity while maintaining its immunogenicity, its ability to provoke an immune response. The diluted venom is injected into a host animal, traditionally horses, but sometimes sheep, goats, or other large animals. The injection schedule follows a careful protocol, starting with very small amounts and gradually increasing over weeks or months. This is essentially controlled mithridatism applied to animals. The host animal's immune system responds to this foreign protein by producing antibodies, specialized proteins that can recognize and bind to specific molecular structures, in this case, the toxins in the venom. Over time, the animal develops high levels of these venom-specific antibodies circulating in its bloodstream. Periodically, blood is drawn from the animal, typically from the jugular vein, and the serum containing the antibodies is separated from the blood cells. This serum undergoes purification processes to concentrate the antibodies and remove unwanted proteins and other components. The purified antibodies constitute the antivenom. Quality control testing ensures the antivenom can effectively neutralize the target venom. Finally, the antivenom is packaged and distributed to hospitals and clinics, ready to save lives. When someone is bitten by a venomous snake, time becomes critical. Venom begins working immediately, and the longer it remains active in the body, the more damage it causes. Early administration of appropriate antivenom can literally be the difference between life and death, between minor injury and permanent disability. The antibodies in the antivenom bind to venom components, preventing them from interacting with body tissues. This doesn't reverse damage already done, but it stops further harm and gives the body's own repair mechanisms a chance to work. One challenge in antivenom production is specificity. Different snake species have different venoms with distinct compositions. A monovalent antivenom, produced using venom from a single species, works best against that specific snake, but may have limited effectiveness against other species. Polyvalent antivenoms, produced using venoms from multiple species, can neutralize a broader range of snake venoms, which is useful in regions where multiple venomous species exist, and identification of the culprit snake may be difficult or impossible. However, polyvalent antivenoms generally have lower concentrations of antibodies against any specific venom component, potentially reducing effectiveness compared to targeted monovalent products. Recent innovations include syndromic antivenoms, which are designed based on symptom patterns rather than species identification. For example, a neurotoxic polyvalent antivenom might be produced using venoms from several species known to cause neurological symptoms, while a hemotoxic version targets species whose venoms primarily affect blood and tissue. This approach, pioneered by institutions like the Thai Red Cross, offers practical advantages in clinical settings where rapid treatment is needed without waiting for species identification. Receptor antagonism represents another elegant antidote mechanism. Many poisons work by binding to specific receptors on cells, triggering harmful responses. An antidote that acts as a receptor antagonist competes for these same binding sites, essentially blocking the poison from having its effect. Naloxone, used to reverse opioid overdoses, exemplifies this mechanism beautifully. Opioid drugs, both prescription painkillers like morphine or oxycodone and illegal drugs like heroin and fentanyl, work by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord. When activated, these receptors reduce pain perception, but also slow breathing and decrease consciousness. In an overdose, respiratory depression can become so severe that the person stops breathing entirely, leading to death from lack of oxygen. Naloxone has a chemical structure similar enough to opioids that it can bind to opioid receptors, but different enough that it doesn't activate them. It's a pure antagonist, occupying the receptor without triggering a response. When naloxone is administered to someone experiencing an opioid overdose, it rapidly displaces opioid molecules from receptors throughout the nervous system. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, the person's breathing improves, consciousness returns, and pupils which had constricted to pinpoints from the opioid begin to dilate. The transformation can be dramatic, almost miraculous. Someone who appeared dead suddenly reviving and taking deep breaths. The development and widespread distribution of naloxone has saved countless lives during the ongoing opioid crisis. Emergency medical services carry it routinely, police officers often carry it, and many jurisdictions have programs to distribute naloxone to people who use opioids or their family members. The medication is available as an injection and as a nasal spray, making it accessible to non-medical personnel. Public health initiatives have worked to reduce stigma around carrying and using naloxone, emphasizing that reversing an overdose is far more important than worries about enabling drug use. One complexity with naloxone relates to its duration of action. Naloxone is metabolized and eliminated from the body relatively quickly, typically within 30 to 90 minutes. Some opioids, particularly long-acting ones like methadone or certain fentanyl analogs, remain in the system much longer. This means that after the naloxone wears off, the person can slip back into overdose. Multiple doses of naloxone may be needed, or the person may need a continuous infusion in a hospital setting. Additionally, when naloxone reverses an opioid's effects in someone who has been using opioids regularly, it can precipitate withdrawal symptoms. Suddenly, all those opioid receptors that have been continuously activated become unoccupied, and the body reacts strongly. The person may experience nausea, vomiting, agitation, sweating, and pain. These symptoms, while unpleasant, are preferable to death from respiratory depression, but they complicate the medical and social dimensions of overdose response. Atropine provides another example of receptor antagonism in antidote applications. Organophosphate pesticides and nerve agents work by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. With this enzyme disabled, acetylcholine accumulates at nerve synapses, causing continuous stimulation. This leads to a characteristic toxidrome, a pattern of symptoms including excessive salivation, tearing, urination, defecation, constriction of airways, slow heart rate, and eventually seizures and respiratory failure. Atropine, which blocks muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, can counteract many of these effects. It won't restore acetylcholinesterase function, but it prevents the accumulated acetylcholine from overstimulating its receptors. In severe organophosphate poisoning, enormous doses of atropine may be needed, sometimes hundreds of milligrams compared to the usual medical dose of 1 or 2 milligrams. Patients may require continuous atropine infusions for days until their bodies can synthesize new acetylcholinesterase enzymes to replace those that were poisoned. Enzyme induction or inhibition represents yet another antidote mechanism. Some poisons aren't directly toxic, but are converted into toxic metabolites by enzymes in the liver. If we can block these enzymes, we prevent the formation of the toxic product. Fomepizole, used to treat poisoning from methanol or ethylene glycol, works this way. Methanol, found in some solvents and windshield washer fluid, and ethylene glycol, the main component of antifreeze, are themselves not particularly toxic. But when the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase metabolizes them, it produces highly toxic compounds. Methanol becomes formaldehyde and formic acid, which damage the eyes and can cause blindness and affect the brain. Ethylene glycol becomes glycolic acid and oxalic acid, which cause severe metabolic acidosis and kidney damage. Fomepizole inhibits alcohol dehydrogenase, preventing these conversions. The unmetabolized methanol or ethylene glycol can then be slowly eliminated by the kidneys or removed more quickly through hemodialysis. Interestingly, before fomepizole became available, ethanol was used for the same purpose. Ethanol is also metabolized by alcohol dehydrogenase, and if given in high enough concentrations, it competes with methanol or ethylene glycol for the enzyme, reducing the formation of toxic metabolites. This meant that treating antifreeze poisoning involved essentially getting the patient drunk and maintaining them in that state while their body eliminated the poison. Fomepizole, being a more specific and predictable inhibitor, has largely replaced ethanol, but the ethanol treatment remains a fascinating example of using one poison to counteract another. Metabolic enhancement represents the opposite approach, increasing the body's ability to process and eliminate the poison. N-acetylcysteine, the antidote for acetaminophen overdose, works partially through this mechanism. Acetaminophen, known as paracetamol in many countries, is one of the most commonly used pain relievers and fever reducers. At therapeutic doses, it's quite safe, but in overdose, which can occur either through deliberate self-harm or through accidental excessive use, it causes severe liver damage. The mechanism involves acetaminophen being converted by liver enzymes into a reactive metabolite called NAPQI. Normally, this toxic metabolite is immediately neutralized by glutathione, an antioxidant molecule present in liver cells. But in an overdose, the glutathione supply becomes depleted and NAPQI accumulates, reacting with liver cell proteins and causing cell death. If enough liver cells die, the person develops acute liver failure, which is fatal without a liver transplant. N-acetylcysteine, or NAC, helps in multiple ways. It provides cysteine, a building block that the body can use to synthesize new glutathione, replenishing depleted stores. It may also directly bind to some NAPQI, neutralizing it. The effectiveness of NAC is highly time-dependent. Given within 8 hours of acetaminophen ingestion, it's extremely effective, preventing liver damage in nearly all cases. Between 8 and 24 hours, it's still helpful, but less reliably protective. After 24 hours, significant liver damage may already have occurred, though NAC may still provide some benefit. This time, dependency creates urgency in treating suspected acetaminophen overdoses. Many emergency departments have protocols for immediately starting NAC, even before blood test results confirm acetaminophen levels, because every hour counts. The experience of receiving NAC treatment is often unpleasant. The intravenous formulation has a strong sulfur smell and can cause nausea and vomiting, especially in the initial loading dose. Some patients experience anaphylactoid reactions, though these are usually manageable. Despite these side effects, NAC is remarkably safe and has saved countless lives since its introduction for acetaminophen poisoning in the 1970s. The treatment protocol typically involves a loading dose, followed by a continuous infusion over 20 hours or more, depending on specific circumstances. Some antidotes work by bypassing the poison's mechanism entirely, providing the body with alternative pathways or supporting vital functions that the poison has disrupted. Oxygen therapy for carbon monoxide poisoning demonstrates this approach. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin with approximately 200 times greater affinity than oxygen does. When carbon monoxide is present in inhaled air, even at relatively low concentrations, it gradually displaces oxygen from hemoglobin molecules. The result is tissue hypoxia, lack of oxygen delivery to organs and tissues. The brain and heart, being the most oxygen-dependent organs, suffer first and most severely. Carbon monoxide poisoning can cause headache, confusion, dizziness, and at high levels, loss of consciousness and death. The treatment is straightforward in concept, but requires understanding the kinetics of carbon monoxide elimination. Breathing normal room air, which contains about 21% oxygen, a person will eventually eliminate carbon monoxide as their lungs gradually exchange the carbon monoxide bound to hemoglobin for oxygen. However, this process is slow. The half-life of carbon monoxide in the blood, the time it takes for half of it to be eliminated, is about 4 to 6 hours breathing room air. By administering pure oxygen through a tight-fitting mask, we increase the amount of oxygen available to compete with carbon monoxide for hemoglobin-binding sites. This reduces the half-life to about 40 to 60 minutes, speeding elimination by a factor of 5 or 6. For severe poisoning, hyperbaric oxygen therapy can be used, placing the patient in a chamber pressurized to 2 to 3 atmospheres while breathing pure oxygen. This can reduce the carbon monoxide half-life to about 20 minutes. The faster we can eliminate carbon monoxide and restore normal oxygen delivery, the less damage occurs, particularly to the brain. Some victims of severe carbon monoxide poisoning develop delayed neurological sequelae, cognitive problems that emerge days or weeks after the poisoning event. Aggressive treatment with oxygen, especially hyperbaric oxygen if available, appears to reduce the risk of these delayed effects, though the evidence is still being studied. The concept of supportive care extends beyond specific antidotes to the entire field of critical care medicine. For many poisonings, no specific antidote exists. Treatment focuses on supporting vital functions, maintaining breathing and circulation, correcting metabolic disturbances, and giving the body time to metabolize and eliminate the poison. Modern intensive care units can temporarily replace the function of organs that have been damaged by poisoning. Mechanical ventilators breathe for patients whose respiratory drive has been suppressed or whose lung function has been compromised. Hemodialysis can remove some poisons from the bloodstream and compensate for kidney failure. Medications can support blood pressure and heart function. In this sense, the ICU itself becomes an antidote, not by directly counteracting the poison's mechanism, but by preventing death while the body recovers. The science of antidotes continues to evolve. Researchers are developing new approaches based on understanding at the molecular level. Monoclonal antibodies, highly specific antibodies created through biotechnology rather than animal immunization, are being explored for treating various poisonings. These have advantages in terms of consistency, lack of animal-derived proteins that can cause allergic reactions, and potentially greater specificity. Experimental antidotes using enzyme therapy, where the antidote is an enzyme that breaks down the poison, show promise for certain toxins. Nanoparticles designed to absorb and sequester poisons are being studied. The field is moving from empirical remedies like theriac toward rationally designed interventions based on detailed understanding of poison mechanisms and human biochemistry. One of the most important developments in antidote availability is the concept of antidote banking. Many effective antidotes exist, but they're expensive to produce, have limited shelf lives, and are needed rarely. Individual hospitals may stock small quantities, but when a mass casualty event occurs, perhaps a chemical spill or attack, these local supplies would be quickly exhausted. Antidote banking involves strategic stockpiling at regional, national, or international levels, with systems in place for rapid distribution when needed. The World Health Organization and various national health agencies maintain such stockpiles for critical antidotes. This represents a public health approach to a problem that goes back to Mithridates: how to ensure that protection against poisons is available when needed, despite the unpredictability of when that need will arise. Modern forensic toxicology has transformed how we detect and understand poisoning. In earlier centuries, poisoning investigations relied on symptoms, circumstances, and sometimes crude chemical tests. The Marsh test for arsenic, developed in 1836, was revolutionary, but still required relatively large amounts of poison and could only test for specific substances. Today's forensic toxicologists have access to extraordinarily sophisticated analytical instruments that can detect vanishingly small quantities of hundreds or thousands of different substances. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry and liquid chromatography tandem, mass spectrometry, are the workhorses of modern forensic toxicology laboratories. These techniques separate complex mixtures into individual components and then identify those components with remarkable precision based on their physical and chemical properties. The sensitivity of these methods is astounding. Modern mass spectrometers can detect substances at concentrations measured in picograms per milliliter, trillionths of a gram per milliliter. To put this in perspective, if you dissolved 1 grain of salt in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, modern instruments could detect it. This sensitivity allows forensic toxicologists to find evidence of poisoning, even when the substance was administered in very small amounts or when considerable time has passed since exposure. Hair analysis, for example, can reveal drug use or poison exposure that occurred months earlier, as substances become incorporated into growing hair and remain there as a permanent record. The process of forensic toxicological analysis typically begins with screening tests, broad surveys that can detect classes of substances, immunoassays, which use antibodies to detect specific types of drugs or poisons, are common screening tools. These are relatively quick and inexpensive, but can produce false positives and have limited ability to distinguish between similar compounds. Positive screening results must be confirmed with more specific tests. This is where chromatography and mass spectrometry come in. These confirmatory tests can definitively identify specific substances, and quantify their concentrations, information crucial for determining whether toxic levels were present. Different biological samples provide different information. Blood is often the specimen of choice for determining recent exposure and for correlating concentration with clinical effects. The concentration of a substance in blood at the time of death can help establish whether it was present at toxic or lethal levels. Urine can reveal drug use over a longer time window, as many substances or their metabolites concentrate in urine and remain detectable for days after blood levels have declined. Liver tissue often contains high concentrations of drugs and poisons, as the liver is the primary site of metabolism. Gastric contents can reveal what was recently ingested and may contain undigested pills or high concentrations of ingested poisons. Hair, fingernails, bone, and even teeth can preserve evidence of exposure over weeks, months, or years. Interpreting toxicological findings requires expertise and careful consideration of context. The mere presence of a substance doesn't necessarily mean it caused death or impairment. The toxicologist must consider the concentration, the known effects of that substance at various dose levels, the circumstances of the case, the autopsy findings, and the deceased's medical history and medication use. Post-mortem redistribution can complicate interpretation, as concentrations in blood can change after death as substances diffuse from tissues and organs into the circulation. What appears to be a very high concentration might partially reflect this post-mortem change rather than the ante-mortem concentration. The forensic toxicologist often serves as an expert witness in criminal and civil proceedings, explaining technical findings to judges and juries who have no scientific training. This requires not just scientific knowledge, but the ability to communicate complex concepts clearly and withstand cross-examination. The toxicologist must present findings objectively, acknowledging uncertainties and limitations, avoiding overstatement while still providing clear opinions based on the evidence. In poisoning cases, toxicological evidence is often crucial in determining whether a death was homicide, suicide, or accident, and whether criminal charges are appropriate. The relationship between poisons and medicines is one of the most fascinating paradoxes in all of science. Substances we fear as deadly toxins have become some of our most valuable therapeutic agents. Digitalis, extracted from foxglove plants, is a potent poison that has killed many who mistook the plant for something edible or who used it incorrectly as an herbal remedy. Yet in carefully controlled doses, digitalis compounds like digoxin are essential medications for certain heart conditions, helping to regulate heart rhythm and improve cardiac output in heart failure. The difference between poison and medicine is purely a matter of dose and intent. Botulinum toxin, the deadliest poison known with an LD50 of about 1 nanogram per kilogram, might seem an unlikely candidate for medical use. Yet Botox, purified botulinum toxin, has become one of the most widely used therapeutic agents and cosmetic treatments in the world. The toxin works by blocking the release of acetylcholine at neuromuscular junctions, causing paralysis. In poisoning, this leads to progressive paralysis, including respiratory muscles, resulting in death. But when tiny amounts are injected into specific muscles, it can treat conditions involving excessive muscle contraction or spasm. Cervical dystonia, a painful condition where neck muscles contract involuntarily, responds well to botulinum toxin injections. Excessive sweating, chronic migraines, overactive bladder, and various other conditions can be treated with carefully placed botulinum toxin injections. And of course, its cosmetic use to temporarily reduce wrinkles has made it familiar to millions. The dose used for these applications is measured in units that represent tiny fractions of what would constitute a dangerous exposure, a perfect demonstration of Paracelsus's principle. Warfarin's story is equally remarkable. Initially developed as a rat poison, warfarin causes fatal bleeding in rodents that consume it repeatedly. It works by interfering with vitamin K-dependent clotting factors, so blood loses its ability to clot properly. Rats eat warfarin-laced bait over several days and eventually suffer internal bleeding and die. Yet this same mechanism makes warfarin valuable as an anticoagulant medication for humans at risk of dangerous blood clots. Patients with atrial fibrillation, artificial heart valves, or previous thromboembolism may benefit from carefully controlled anticoagulation with warfarin, which reduces their risk of stroke and other thromboembolic events. The challenge lies in finding the right dose for each patient, enough to reduce clotting risk, but not so much as to cause dangerous bleeding. Regular blood tests monitor the degree of anticoagulation, and doses are adjusted accordingly. Too much warfarin causes bleeding complications. Too little fails to provide protection against clots. This narrow therapeutic window exemplifies why some poisons-turned medicines require such careful medical supervision. Chemotherapy for cancer relies extensively on substances that are fundamentally toxic. Many chemotherapy drugs are cell poisons, substances that interfere with cell division or DNA replication or cellular metabolism. These drugs don't selectively kill only cancer cells. They affect all rapidly dividing cells, which is why chemotherapy causes side effects like hair loss, damage to the lining of the digestive tract, and suppression of bone marrow function. The therapeutic principle is that cancer cells, dividing more rapidly than most normal cells, are more susceptible to these toxic effects. The goal is to administer enough drug to kill cancer cells while keeping damage to normal tissues within survivable limits. It's a brutal approach, essentially controlled poisoning, and the difference between effective treatment and fatal toxicity can be narrow. Yet for many cancers, chemotherapy provides the only chance for cure or significant prolongation of life. Some chemotherapy drugs have origins in natural toxins that have been studied and modified. Vinca alkaloids, derived from the Madagascar periwinkle plant, interfere with cell division by disrupting microtubules, structures essential for separating chromosomes during cell division. Taxanes, originally isolated from the bark of the Pacific yew tree, work through a different mechanism, stabilizing microtubules in a way that also prevents proper cell division. Anthracyclines, while synthetic, are related to natural products and damage DNA while interfering with topoisomerase enzymes. These drugs' origins in plant toxins reflect the reality that plants have evolved chemical warfare agents to defend themselves against herbivores and pathogens. And we've learned to repurpose those agents for our own medical battles. The future of toxin-based therapeutics looks remarkably promising. Researchers are exploring venoms from various creatures as sources of new drugs. Cone snail venom, for example, contains peptides called toxins that target specific nerve channels with extraordinary selectivity. One conotoxin-derived drug, ziconotide, is used to treat severe chronic pain in patients who don't respond to opioids. It works through a completely different mechanism than traditional pain medications, blocking calcium channels in pain-signaling neurons. Hundreds of other conotoxins are being studied for potential applications in pain management, epilepsy, and other neurological conditions. Spider venoms similarly contain compounds that affect ion channels and receptors in ways that might be therapeutically useful. Scorpion venoms are being investigated for potential use in targeting certain cancer cells. This research involves collaborations between toxinologists who study venoms and toxins, chemists who can isolate and characterize active compounds, and pharmacologists who can test therapeutic applications. It's painstaking work. A single venom might contain hundreds of different peptides and proteins. Each must be isolated and characterized. Most will have no therapeutic potential, but a few might show promising activity. Those candidates then undergo extensive testing for safety and efficacy, a process that can take years or decades. Yet the potential rewards are enormous. Venoms represent millions of years of evolutionary optimization for affecting specific biological targets. We're essentially mining nature's chemical library for compounds that have been proven effective through natural selection, then adapting them for medical use. This brings us full circle to Mithridates and the ancient quest for the universal antidote. While theriac and mithridatium were ultimately failures as panaceas, the underlying insight was sound. Understanding poisons allows us to protect against them. Modern antidote development vindicated this principle while discarding the magical thinking that surrounded ancient preparations. We understand now that there is no universal antidote, no single substance that protects against all poisons, but we have developed a sophisticated pharmacopoeia of specific antidotes, each rationally designed based on understanding the mechanism of a particular poison or class of poisons. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us how quickly our relationship with toxins and medicines can become relevant on a global scale. The race to develop treatments and vaccines involved every principle we've discussed: understanding dose-response relationships, managing side effects, conducting careful trials to establish safety and efficacy, manufacturing and distributing products at unprecedented scale. Ivermectin, an antiparasitic drug derived from soil bacteria, generated controversy when some promoted it as a COVID treatment despite lack of evidence. The debate highlighted how our understanding of appropriate dosing, specific indications, and evidence-based medicine has evolved since the days of theriac, yet how persistent the human desire for simple solutions to complex problems remains. As we look to the future, several trends seem clear. Personalized medicine will increasingly allow us to tailor both treatments and toxicity predictions to individual patients based on their genetic makeup, current health status, and other factors. Some people metabolize certain drugs quickly, others slowly, and these differences can dramatically affect both efficacy and risk of toxicity. Pharmacogenomic testing can identify these variations, allowing doctors to adjust doses or choose alternative medications. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are being applied to toxicology, potentially allowing us to predict toxicity of new compounds without extensive animal testing. and to identify potential antidotes more efficiently. Regenerative medicine may eventually allow us to repair damage from poisoning in ways currently impossible. The ethics of poison use continue to evolve. Chemical weapons, essentially poisons deployed as weapons of war, are banned by international convention, yet development and stockpiling continue in some nations, and occasional use in conflicts or assassinations reminds us that these weapons remain a threat. Pesticides, necessary for modern agriculture, continue to cause accidental poisonings, particularly in developing nations where safety precautions may be inadequate. Environmental toxins, from lead in water systems to air pollution to microplastics, represent chronic low-level exposures whose effects may only become apparent over years or decades. These are poisons in the original sense, substances that harm living organisms, yet they're often byproducts of modern life rather than deliberately created toxins. Addressing these challenges requires not just toxicology, but also policy, engineering, economics, and social change. One thing is certain: our relationship with poisons and antidotes will continue to fascinate and challenge us. Every poison tells a story about chemistry, biology, history, and human nature. Every antidote represents human ingenuity and the desire to protect and heal. From the painted arrows of our prehistoric ancestors to the molecular precision of modern pharmacology, from Mithridates' desperate experiments to the synthesis of monoclonal antibodies, from the deadly nightshade in a medieval witch's garden to the Botox injection in a modern clinic, we see the same pattern repeated. Substances that can harm can also heal, and understanding them gives us power over our own biology and destiny. The science of poison and antidotes ultimately reflects something profound about the human condition. We live in a world filled with substances that can kill us, yet also filled with potential cures. Our survival has always depended on learning to distinguish between the two, on understanding that context and quantity matter, that knowledge is protection, that nature provides both the arrow and the shield. The ancient concept of theriac was wrong in its details, but right in its aspiration. There should be defenses against the hazards we face. Modern medicine provides those defenses, not through magical universal panaceas, but through careful science, rational drug development, evidence-based practice, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of researchers, clinicians, and toxicologists who have dedicated their lives to understanding these substances and how to counteract them. The history of accidental poisonings reveals another dimension of this story, one that speaks to the everyday dangers that have surrounded humans throughout history. Long before industrial chemicals and synthetic drugs, people died from mistaken identity of plants. Mushroom poisoning has claimed countless lives across millennia, and it continues to do so today. The problem is that some of the deadliest mushrooms closely resemble edible varieties. The deathcap mushroom, Amanita phalloides, appears innocuous, with a pale greenish-gray or yellowish cap that could be mistaken for several edible species. Yet it contains amatoxins, among the most poisonous substances known from any life form. A single mushroom, even a portion of one, contains enough amatoxin to kill an adult human. The mechanism of amatoxin poisoning is particularly insidious. Amatoxins inhibit RNA polymerase II, an enzyme absolutely essential for transcribing genes into messenger RNA. Without messenger RNA, cells cannot synthesize the proteins they need to survive. The liver, being the primary site of toxin metabolism and having very high protein synthesis rates, suffers most severely. But the effects don't appear immediately. There's a deceptive latency period of 6 to 24 hours after ingestion, during which the victim may feel fine or experience only mild gastrointestinal discomfort. Then, the second phase begins: severe vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and dehydration. Some patients seem to improve after this phase, a false recovery that can last 1 to 2 days. But then the third phase strikes, as liver cells that have been dying throughout this period finally cause organ failure. Jaundice appears, bleeding occurs as clotting factors disappear, and hepatic encephalopathy develops as toxins that the liver would normally clear accumulate in the bloodstream and affect the brain. Kidney failure often follows. Without a liver transplant, which must happen quickly once organ failure begins, death is likely. Treatment of amatoxin poisoning exemplifies the limits of current antidote therapy. Silibinin, extracted from milk thistle, may provide some benefit if given early, by potentially blocking amatoxin uptake by liver cells. High-dose intravenous penicillin has been used based on the theory that it might displace amatoxins from plasma proteins, though evidence for effectiveness is limited. Activated charcoal and other methods to enhance elimination may help if the toxins haven't been fully absorbed yet. But once significant liver damage has occurred, supportive care and preparation for possible liver transplantation become the main approaches. The tragedy of mushroom poisoning is compounded by that initial latency period. By the time symptoms become severe, irreversible damage has often already occurred. If mushroom poisoning is suspected, aggressive treatment should begin immediately, even before symptoms worsen, because that window of opportunity closes quickly. The annual cycle of mushroom poisoning cases, peaking in fall when many wild mushrooms fruit, reminds us that nature's dangers haven't disappeared in our modern world. Every year, emergency departments see cases of people who thought they knew how to identify edible mushrooms but made a fatal mistake. Folklore about how to distinguish poisonous from edible mushrooms is often completely unreliable. Rules like mushrooms that grow on wood are safe, or mushrooms that animals eat are safe for humans, or mushrooms that change color when cut are poisonous. These are all dangerously false. The only reliable way to avoid mushroom poisoning is to be absolutely certain of identification, which requires expertise, or to simply avoid eating foraged mushrooms unless they've been identified by a true expert. Even experienced mycologists use multiple characteristics and sometimes microscopic examination or chemical testing to make certain identifications. The interaction between alcohol and various substances represents another area where poisoning can occur in ways people don't expect. Alcohol itself, ethanol, is a toxin, though we don't usually think of it that way. Its LD50 in humans is estimated around 5 to 8 grams per kilogram, meaning a 70-kilogram person could die from consuming 350 to 560 grams of pure ethanol in a short time period. That's roughly equivalent to 20 to 30 standard drinks consumed rapidly. Acute alcohol poisoning kills through respiratory depression, aspiration of vomit, and cardiovascular effects. But even at non-lethal doses, Alcohol interacts with numerous medications and other substances in ways that can be dangerous. Alcohol potentiates the effects of sedative medications, opioids, and other central nervous system depressants. The combination can cause profound sedation and respiratory depression, even when each substance alone would be relatively safe at the doses taken. This additive or synergistic effect has contributed to countless overdose deaths. Alcohol also affects drug metabolism in the liver. Chronic heavy drinking induces certain liver enzymes, which can speed up the metabolism of some medications, potentially reducing their effectiveness. But acute alcohol consumption can inhibit these same enzymes, slowing metabolism and causing drugs to accumulate to toxic levels. The acetaminophen-alcohol interaction is particularly concerning. Even moderate amounts of alcohol can enhance acetaminophen's liver toxicity, and chronic heavy drinkers are at increased risk of liver damage from acetaminophen at doses that would be safe for others. Disulfiram, a medication used to treat alcohol dependence, deliberately creates a poisonous interaction with alcohol. Disulfiram inhibits aldehyde dehydrogenase, an enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde, a toxic metabolite of alcohol. Normally, acetaldehyde is rapidly converted to acetate and eliminated, but with aldehyde dehydrogenase blocked, acetaldehyde accumulates if the person drinks alcohol. This causes an intensely unpleasant reaction: flushing, rapid heart rate, nausea, vomiting, headache, and a feeling of impending doom. The reaction is so aversive that ideally it deters drinking. The medication creates a situation where alcohol becomes poisonous, transforming a substance the person is addicted to into something that makes them violently ill. It's a clever but rather brutal approach to addiction treatment. The development of the therapeutic index concept and the mathematical modeling of drug kinetics and dynamics represented major advances in making poisoning prevention more systematic and scientific. Pharmacokinetics describes what the body does to a drug, how it's absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and eliminated. Pharmacodynamics describes what the drug does to the body, how it interacts with receptors or enzymes to produce effects. Understanding both is essential for predicting toxicity. A drug that's rapidly eliminated from the body has a shorter duration of action and may require more frequent dosing, but also poses less risk of accumulation to toxic levels. A drug that's slowly metabolized may provide longer-lasting effects, but requires careful attention to avoid overdose, especially if multiple doses are given before earlier doses have been fully eliminated. The volume of distribution, a pharmacokinetic parameter, describes how extensively a drug distributes from the bloodstream into tissues. A drug with a large volume of distribution spreads widely throughout the body, which can make it harder to remove through methods like hemodialysis that primarily clear substances from blood. A drug with a small volume of distribution stays mainly in the bloodstream and extracellular fluid, where it may be more accessible to removal strategies. These properties influence both the nature of toxicity and the effectiveness of treatments. Understanding them allows toxicologists to predict how poisoning will manifest and what interventions might be most effective. Therapeutic drug monitoring, the practice of measuring drug concentrations in patients' blood to guide dosing, applies these principles clinically. For medications with narrow therapeutic ranges like lithium, digoxin, aminoglycoside antibiotics, and some seizure medications, regular blood level measurements help maintain concentrations in the therapeutic range while avoiding toxic levels. This prevents both underdosing, which fails to treat the condition effectively, and overdosing, which causes toxicity. The specific target ranges and timing of blood draws must be carefully considered. For some drugs, we measure trough levels, the lowest concentration just before the next dose, to ensure adequate levels are maintained. For others, we measure peak levels after absorption to ensure we're not reaching toxic concentrations. The story of lead poisoning illuminates how our understanding of chronic toxicity has evolved. Lead, that useful metal that's been extracted and worked for thousands of years, has been poisoning people for just as long, though the effects weren't always recognized. The Romans used lead extensively in plumbing, in cooking vessels, in cosmetics, and to sweeten wine. Some historians have speculated that chronic lead poisoning among the Roman elite may have contributed to the empire's decline, though this theory remains controversial. What's certain is that many Romans suffered from lead toxicity without understanding the cause. Symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include abdominal pain, constipation, fatigue, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, tremors, and peripheral neuropathy. In children, lead exposure interferes with normal brain development, potentially causing permanent cognitive impairment, behavioral problems, and learning difficulties. Lead's toxicity comes from its ability to substitute for other metals in biological systems. It can replace calcium in some contexts, iron in others, and zinc in yet others. This allows lead to interfere with numerous enzyme systems and cellular processes. It disrupts hemosynthesis, the creation of the oxygen-carrying component of hemoglobin, leading to anemia. It affects neurotransmitter function in the brain, particularly interfering with glutamate, which is crucial for learning and memory. It damages the developing brain's architecture, interfering with the formation of connections between neurons. The effects of childhood lead exposure can last a lifetime, even after lead levels are brought down. The recognition of lead's danger to children drove major public health initiatives in the 20th century. Lead-based paint, once common in homes, was banned in the United States in 1978, though houses painted before then still contain lead. When this paint deteriorates or is disturbed during renovation, lead dust can contaminate the environment. Children, who naturally put things in their mouths and play on floors where dust accumulates, are particularly vulnerable. The elimination of lead from gasoline, completed in the United States in 1996, dramatically reduced environmental lead exposure. When leaded gasoline was burned in engines, lead particles were spewed into the air, settled onto soil and into water, and entered the food chain. The phase-out of leaded gasoline is considered one of the great public health successes of the 20th century. Yet lead poisoning hasn't disappeared. The water crisis in Flint, Michigan, beginning in 2014, exposed thousands of residents, including children, to dangerous lead levels when changes in the water supply corroded lead pipes and leaching lead into drinking water. The tragedy highlighted how infrastructure failures can recreate problems we thought we'd solved. It also revealed social and environmental justice dimensions of poisoning. The mostly poor and minority residents of Flint suffered from governmental neglect and systemic failures that would likely have been addressed more quickly in wealthier, whiter communities. Treatment of lead poisoning involves first and foremost eliminating ongoing exposure, without which treatment is futile. Chelation therapy with agents like succinylcholine or EDTA can help remove lead from the blood and some tissue compartments, but it cannot reverse damage already done to the nervous system. Prevention remains far more important than treatment. Screening children in high-risk areas, maintaining and remediating older housing, ensuring safe water supplies. These public health measures prevent lead poisoning far more effectively than medicine can treat it after the fact. Mercury poisoning offers another example of a metal poison with profound historical impact. Mercury, that strange liquid metal, fascinated alchemists and early chemists who thought it might be a key to transmuting base metals into gold. Its uses ranged from medicine to industrial processes to mirror making. Hat makers used mercury compounds in treating felt, leading to the phrase "mad as a hatter," as chronic mercury exposure caused neurological damage, including tremors, irritability, and cognitive changes. The character of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland reflects this occupational hazard of 19th century hatmakers. Mercury exists in several forms with different toxicity profiles. Elemental mercury, the liquid metal, is actually relatively non-toxic if ingested in small amounts because it's poorly absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. However, breathing mercury vapor is extremely dangerous as it's readily absorbed through the lungs and crosses the blood-brain barrier, causing neurological damage. Mercury vapor poisoning was a risk for miners extracting mercury ore and for workers in various industries that used mercury. Inorganic mercury salts, like mercuric chloride, are much more toxic when ingested, causing severe gastrointestinal damage and kidney failure. But the most insidious mercury poisoning comes from organic mercury compounds, particularly methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is efficiently absorbed and distributed throughout the body, including into the brain. It's particularly toxic to the developing nervous system, making it extremely dangerous for pregnant women, as it can cause severe birth defects and developmental disorders. The tragedy of Minamata, Japan, illustrates methylmercury's dangers. From the 1930s through the 1960s, a chemical plant discharged mercury-laden wastewater into Minamata Bay. Bacteria in the sediment converted the mercury into methylmercury, which bioaccumulated up the food chain, reaching high concentrations in fish and shellfish. Thousands of local residents who relied on the bay for food developed mercury poisoning, now known as Minamata disease. Symptoms included sensory disturbances, tremors, difficulty walking, slurred speech, and in severe cases, convulsions, coma, and death. Children born to mothers who consumed contaminated fish during pregnancy had devastating neurological damage, even when the mothers showed minimal symptoms. The Minamata disaster led to much greater awareness of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, processes by which toxic substances can reach dangerous concentrations in organisms at the top of food chains, even when environmental concentrations seem low. Methylmercury binds strongly to proteins and has a very long biological half-life. A fish exposed to low levels throughout its life accumulates mercury that doesn't get eliminated efficiently. A larger predator fish that eats many smaller fish accumulates all the mercury from its prey. By the time you get to tuna or swordfish or other large predatory fish, methyl mercury concentrations can be thousands of times higher than in the surrounding water. This is why public health advisories recommend limiting consumption of certain fish species, particularly for pregnant women and young children. Treatment of mercury poisoning depends on the form and timing. For acute inorganic mercury poisoning, chelation therapy can help, though it must be initiated quickly before irreversible damage occurs. For methyl mercury poisoning, chelation is less effective because the mercury has already distributed widely and bound to tissues. Prevention through avoiding exposure is crucial. The medical use of mercury, once common in medicines like calomel, a mercury chloride compound used as a laxative, has been largely abandoned. Mercury thermometers have been replaced with digital or alcohol-based alternatives in many places. Dental amalgam, which contains about 50% mercury, has been controversial, though most evidence suggests it's safe for the vast majority of people. Regulatory efforts have focused on reducing mercury emissions from coal-burning power plants and other industrial sources, as mercury released into the atmosphere eventually settles into waterways where it can enter the food chain. The story of thalidomide represents one of the darkest chapters in pharmaceutical history, but also illustrates principles crucial to modern drug safety evaluation. Thalidomide was developed in Germany in the 1950s as a sedative and was marketed as being particularly safe. Unlike barbiturates, the dominant sedatives of that era, thalidomide didn't cause fatal respiratory depression and overdose. It seemed like an ideal sleeping medication and was also promoted to pregnant women for morning sickness. Then, in 1961, two physicians, one in Germany and one in Australia, independently recognized a pattern, an epidemic of babies being born with phocomelia, a rare birth defect where limbs are severely shortened or absent. The German physician eventually linked the cases to thalidomide use during pregnancy. The drug was quickly withdrawn from markets worldwide, but not before an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 children had been born with thalidomide-related birth defects. The thalidomide tragedy transformed drug regulation and testing. It revealed that a drug could be relatively safe in adults, but devastatingly toxic to developing fetuses. It highlighted the importance of timing, as thalidomide caused the most severe defects when taken during a specific narrow window of early pregnancy when limbs are developing, roughly between days 20 to 36 after conception. This is often before a woman even knows she's pregnant, making the drug particularly insidious. It demonstrated that testing in pregnant animals is essential before approving drugs for use during pregnancy. Though even animal testing has limitations, as species differences in metabolism and physiology mean that a drug safe in rats or rabbits might still harm human fetuses. The catastrophe led to much stricter drug approval processes worldwide. In the United States, the FDA's Frances Oldham Kelsey became a hero for refusing to approve thalidomide, despite pressure from the manufacturer. Her insistence on more safety data before approval likely prevented thousands of American babies from being affected. The regulatory framework that emerged from the thalidomide disaster and other pharmaceutical catastrophes represents a delicate balance between ensuring safety and allowing beneficial medications to reach patients. The drug development pipeline, from initial discovery through final approval, now typically takes 10 to 15 years and costs billions of dollars. This extensive process aims to identify toxicities and adverse effects before drugs reach the general population, but it also delays access to potentially beneficial treatments and makes drug development economically viable only for conditions where significant profit potential exists. The phases of clinical trials illustrate this systematic approach to toxicity evaluation. Phase 1 trials involve small numbers of healthy volunteers and focus primarily on safety, determining how the human body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and eliminates the drug, and identifying what doses can be tolerated without causing serious adverse effects. These trials establish the basic safety profile and provide initial pharmacokinetic data. Phase 2 trials involve larger groups of patients who actually have the condition the drug aims to treat. These trials continue safety monitoring while beginning to evaluate efficacy, determining whether the drug actually provides clinical benefit. They establish dose-response relationships, trying to find the dose that provides optimal benefit with acceptable side effects, essentially determining the therapeutic index in real-world use. Phase 3 trials are large-scale studies involving hundreds or thousands of patients at multiple sites, providing definitive evidence of efficacy and safety across diverse populations. Only after successfully completing these phases can a drug be submitted for regulatory approval. Even after approval, monitoring continues. Phase 4, or post-marketing surveillance, tracks drug performance in the much larger and more diverse real-world population. This is when rare adverse effects, occurring in perhaps 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 people, might first be detected. Some toxicities only become apparent with long-term use extending over years or decades. Others occur primarily in special populations, such as the elderly, people with kidney or liver disease, or pregnant women who may have been excluded from or underrepresented in clinical trials. Post-marketing surveillance has led to drugs being withdrawn from the market or having their approved uses restricted after hidden toxicities emerged. Rofecoxib, marketed as Vioxx, was voluntarily withdrawn in 2004 after evidence emerged that it increased cardiovascular risk. Troglitazone, a diabetes medication, was withdrawn in 2000 after causing severe liver toxicity in some users. The concept of pharmacovigilance, the systematic monitoring of drug safety, has become increasingly sophisticated. Electronic health records, prescription databases, and reporting systems allow identification of potential safety signals, patterns suggesting that a drug might be causing problems. Healthcare providers are encouraged to report adverse drug reactions to regulatory agencies. Patients can also report reactions directly. These reports are collected, analyzed for patterns, and investigated when concerns arise. This system isn't perfect. Underreporting is common, and distinguishing between adverse effects genuinely caused by a drug and unrelated medical events occurring coincidentally in people taking the drug requires careful epidemiological analysis. But pharmacovigilance provides crucial safety oversight that clinical trials alone cannot. The economics of antidote development present special challenges. Most antidotes are used rarely, sometimes only a handful of times per year in a given hospital or region. yet they must be available immediately when needed, as delays can be fatal. Manufacturing and maintaining stocks of infrequently used medications isn't profitable in a purely market-driven system. Some life-saving antidotes have been in short supply or temporarily unavailable because manufacturers found them unprofitable to produce. This has led to calls for government stockpiling of critical antidotes, subsidies to maintain production capacity, and international coordination to ensure availability. The World Health Organization maintains a list of essential medicines that includes key antidotes, but ensuring these are actually available everywhere they're needed remains challenging. Generic medications, while crucial for making treatments affordable and accessible, can present quality control challenges relevant to toxicity. When a patent expires and generic manufacturers begin producing copies of a medication, they must demonstrate that their version is bioequivalent to the original, producing similar blood levels and clinical effects. But manufacturing processes differ, and excipients, the inactive ingredients used as fillers or coatings, vary between manufacturers. In most cases, these differences don't matter clinically, but for drugs with narrow therapeutic indices, small variations in absorption or bioavailability could potentially cause either underdosing, leading to treatment failure, or overdosing, causing toxicity. Regulatory agencies monitor generic drug quality, but occasional problems occur. Some countries have less stringent oversight, and substandard or counterfeit medications remain serious problems in parts of the world. Counterfeit medications represent a particularly insidious form of poisoning. These fake drugs, made to resemble legitimate medications, may contain no active ingredient at all, leaving patients untreated for serious conditions, or may contain wrong amounts of active ingredient, causing toxicity from overdose or wrong ingredients entirely, potentially including toxic substances. The production and distribution of counterfeit medications is driven by enormous profit potential and relatively light penalties compared to other forms of crime in many jurisdictions. The WHO estimates that up to 10% of medications globally are counterfeit, with percentages much higher in some regions. Patients and providers often can't distinguish fake medications from real ones without laboratory testing. The internet has made distribution of counterfeits easier, with numerous websites selling medications that may be fake or substandard. This represents a form of mass poisoning motivated purely by greed. Drug interactions, where one medication alters the effects or toxicity of another, add another layer of complexity to preventing poisoning. Some interactions occur at the pharmacokinetic level, where one drug affects another's absorption, distribution, metabolism, or elimination. For example, drugs that induce liver enzymes can speed up metabolism of other drugs, potentially reducing their effectiveness. Drugs that inhibit these enzymes can slow metabolism, causing accumulation and toxicity. Grapefruit juice famously inhibits an enzyme, CYP3A4, that metabolizes many medications, potentially causing toxic levels of drugs that rely on this enzyme for elimination. Pharmacodynamic interactions occur when drugs have additive or opposing effects. Taking multiple sedatives together can cause profound sedation and respiratory depression, even when each individual dose would be safe alone. Understanding these interactions requires knowledge of pharmacology, and with some patients taking 10 or more medications simultaneously, managing interaction risks becomes extremely challenging. Polypharmacy, the use of multiple medications concurrently, is increasingly common, especially in elderly patients with multiple chronic conditions. Each additional medication adds not just its own risk of adverse effects, but also the risk of interactions with all other medications being taken. The number of potential interactions increases exponentially with each added drug. A patient taking 5 medications has 10 possible two-way interactions. Adding a 6th medication adds 5 more potential interactions, bringing the total to 15. By the time someone is taking 10 medications, there are 45 possible two-way interactions, not even considering 3-way or higher-order interactions. Computer systems that check for interactions help, but they often generate so many warnings that important ones get lost in the noise. Deprescribing, systematically evaluating whether each medication is still needed, and attempting to reduce overall medication burden has become an important aspect of geriatric care and medication safety. The opioid epidemic illustrates how legitimate medications can become poisons on a massive scale when improperly prescribed, diverted to non-medical use, or when patients become addicted. Opioid pain medications, used appropriately for short-term acute pain or in palliative care, provide irreplaceable benefits. But aggressive marketing by pharmaceutical companies, inadequate understanding by prescribers of addiction risks, and societal factors combined to create a public health catastrophe. Millions of people became addicted to prescription opioids. As prescribing became more restricted, many transitioned to heroin or illegally manufactured fentanyl, both more dangerous than prescription medications. Fentanyl, particularly, is so potent that tiny amounts, difficult to measure accurately outside pharmaceutical settings, can be fatal. Street fentanyl is often mixed with or sold as other drugs, leading to overdoses in people who don't even know they're taking opioids. The response to the opioid epidemic has involved multiple strategies. Prescription drug monitoring programs track controlled substance prescribing, helping identify potential overprescribing or patients obtaining prescriptions from multiple providers. Guidelines for appropriate opioid prescribing aim to balance pain management with addiction risk. Increased availability of addiction treatment, including medications like buprenorphine and methadone that can prevent withdrawal and reduce cravings, helps some people recover. And crucially, widespread distribution of naloxone to reverse overdoses has saved countless lives. This multifaceted approach recognizes that addiction is a medical condition requiring treatment, not simply a moral failure requiring punishment, and that reducing overdose deaths must be a priority even while working on prevention and treatment. Synthetic cannabinoids, often marketed as Spice or K2, illustrate the dangers of unregulated novel psychoactive substances. These chemicals, designed to mimic marijuana's effects by binding to cannabinoid receptors, are sprayed onto plant material and sold as alternatives to marijuana. But unlike marijuana, which has been used by humans for thousands of years with relatively well understood effects and risks, synthetic cannabinoids are created in clandestine laboratories with no quality control and often no understanding of their toxicity. The chemicals used vary constantly as manufacturers try to stay ahead of laws banning specific compounds. Users have no idea what they're actually ingesting or how potent it might be. Emergency departments have seen outbreaks of severe toxicity from synthetic cannabinoids, including extreme agitation, psychosis, seizures, kidney damage, and death. The poisons here are created deliberately for sale, but without any of the safety testing or regulation that legitimate drugs undergo. Bath salts, synthetic cathinones sold as alternatives to stimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, present similar dangers. These substances can cause severe agitation, hallucinations, paranoia, violent behavior, rapid heart rate, hyperthermia, and sometimes death. The term bath salts is deliberately misleading marketing. The packages may say not for human consumption to avoid drug laws, but they're clearly intended for recreational use. Cases of bizarre, violent behavior attributed to bath salts have made headlines, though the actual prevalence and full scope of toxicity from these substances remain unclear. What's evident is that people are being poisoned by chemicals synthesized specifically to evade drug laws, often with no real knowledge of what they're taking or what effects to expect. The field of toxicogenomics, studying how genetic variations affect responses to toxic substances, offers hope for more personalized approaches to preventing poisoning. We've known for decades that people vary in how they metabolize drugs. Some are rapid metabolizers, breaking down certain drugs quickly and needing higher doses for effect. Others are poor metabolizers, accumulating drugs to potentially toxic levels at standard doses. These differences often reflect genetic variations in drug metabolizing enzymes. With advances in genetic testing, we can potentially identify people at increased risk of toxicity from specific drugs and adjust treatment accordingly. Pharmacogenomic testing is already used clinically for some medications. Before prescribing warfarin, genetic testing for variants affecting warfarin metabolism and response can help determine the appropriate starting dose, potentially reducing bleeding complications. Before prescribing certain chemotherapy drugs, testing for variants affecting metabolism can help identify patients at risk of severe toxicity. As testing becomes cheaper and more comprehensive, we may move toward routine pharmacogenomic testing, perhaps done once in a lifetime, and used to guide medication choices throughout a person's life. Your genetic profile would indicate which medications you're likely to respond well to, which might be ineffective, and which pose increased toxicity risks. This personalized medicine approach could dramatically improve both the efficacy and safety of drug therapy, but it also raises questions about privacy, about potential discrimination by insurers or employers based on genetic information, and about equitable access to these advanced approaches. Environmental toxicology, the study of how toxic substances in the environment affect human health and ecosystems, extends poisoning beyond individual exposures to population level and ecological impacts. Air pollution from burning fossil fuels releases countless toxic substances, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and volatile organic compounds. These pollutants contribute to respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, and premature death. The health impacts fall disproportionately on people living near major roads, industrial facilities, or in areas with poor air quality, often low-income communities and communities of color. This environmental injustice means that some populations bear far greater toxic burdens than others. Water pollution from agricultural runoff Industrial discharge, inadequate sewage treatment, and other sources introduces pesticides, heavy metals, endocrine-disrupting chemicals, and pathogens into water supplies. Even when concentrations are below levels that cause acute toxicity, chronic low-level exposure may contribute to health problems. The difficulty is establishing causal relationships between environmental exposures and health outcomes when effects may be subtle, delayed, and influenced by countless other factors. Environmental epidemiology, studying disease patterns in populations and attempting to link them to environmental exposures, provides crucial evidence but faces significant methodological challenges. Pesticides, essential for modern agriculture but toxic by design, represent a particular challenge. They're meant to kill insects, weeds, fungi, or other pests that threaten crops. But many pesticides have broader toxicity, potentially affecting other organisms, including humans. Organophosphate pesticides, for instance, inhibit acetylcholinesterase not just in insects but in all animals, including humans. Agricultural workers applying pesticides and people living near treated fields face greatest exposure. Pesticide poisoning, both acute from high-level exposure and chronic from repeated low-level exposure, remains a significant global health problem, particularly in developing countries where safety precautions may be inadequate and access to emergency care limited. The concept of endocrine disruption, where chemicals interfere with hormone systems, has gained increasing attention. Substances like bisphenol A, phthalates, and certain pesticides can mimic or block hormones, potentially affecting development, reproduction, and metabolism. These effects may be particularly concerning during critical windows of development, prenatally, and during early childhood, when hormone signaling guides normal growth and maturation. Establishing cause and effect is challenging because endocrine effects may be subtle, appear only in certain exposure windows, and show nonlinear dose-response relationships, where low doses might have different effects than high doses. But the potential implications are significant enough that many jurisdictions have moved to restrict use of chemicals with known or suspected endocrine-disrupting properties, particularly in products intended for infants and children. Microplastics, tiny particles of plastic that now pervade the environment, represent a newly recognized potential toxicity concern. These particles, found in oceans, drinking water, food, and even in human tissues, come from degradation of plastic waste and from direct release of microbeads in personal care products, microfibers from synthetic clothing, and other sources. We're only beginning to understand potential health effects. Microplastics themselves might cause physical effects, but they also concentrate and carry toxic chemicals that adsorb onto their surfaces. As they accumulate in organisms and move up food chains, concentrations increase. Whether human exposure to microplastics causes significant health effects remains an open question, but it's concerning that we've altered the global environment so dramatically without fully understanding the consequences. The concept of One Health, recognizing interconnections between human health, animal health, and environmental health, provides a framework for addressing these complex toxicity issues. Decisions about pesticide use affect not just human health, but also ecosystem health, with potential impacts on pollinators, soil organisms, water quality, and ultimately food security. Veterinary use of antibiotics affects not just animal health, but contributes to antibiotic resistance that threatens human medicine. Environmental contamination from pharmaceutical manufacturing and human use of medications affects aquatic organisms and potentially cycles back to human exposure through drinking water and food. Solutions require integrating across traditional boundaries between medicine, veterinary medicine, ecology, and environmental science. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to environmental toxicology. Changing temperature and precipitation patterns affect where disease vectors like mosquitoes can survive, potentially expanding geographic ranges of diseases they carry. Extreme heat directly causes illness and death, but also affects air quality and concentrations of certain pollutants. Changes in agricultural patterns, forced by shifting climate zones, may alter pesticide use and exposures. Natural disasters, increasingly frequent and severe with climate change, can cause acute toxic exposures when floodwaters inundate industrial sites or damage chemical storage facilities. The slow-moving catastrophe of climate change creates countless pathways by which human health can be affected by toxic exposures. Looking toward the future, artificial intelligence and machine learning offer promise for toxicology. Machine learning algorithms trained on existing data about chemical structures and their toxicities can potentially predict toxicity of new compounds, reducing the need for extensive animal testing and allowing earlier identification of potential problems. These approaches might identify chemicals of concern among the thousands of substances in commercial use that have never been thoroughly tested for toxicity. They might help predict drug interactions or identify patients at high risk of adverse drug reactions based on their medical characteristics and medication regimens. They might optimize antidote dosing by learning from data about previous treatment outcomes. But AI approaches also have limitations and biases, and their predictions must be validated before being relied upon for critical decisions. Nanotechnology, the manipulation of matter at atomic and molecular scales, creates materials with novel properties that might have unexpected toxicities. Nanoparticles behave differently from bulk materials of the same substance. Their small size allows them to cross biological barriers that would normally be impermeable, potentially reaching tissues and organs where larger particles can't go. Their high surface area to volume ratio makes them more chemically reactive. We're incorporating nanomaterials into products ranging from sunscreens to food packaging to electronics, often without thorough understanding of potential health and environmental effects. Nanotoxicology, studying the effects of nanomaterials on biological systems, is playing catch-up, trying to establish safety profiles for substances already in wide use. The story of poisons and antidotes is far from finished. New toxins, whether natural, synthetic, or engineered, will continue to emerge. Our chemical environment will keep evolving, presenting new exposure scenarios and combinations of substances that have never been studied together. But the fundamental principles remain constant. Careful observation, systematic study, understanding mechanisms, developing targeted interventions, and remaining humble about the limits of our knowledge. Every poison teaches us about biology and chemistry. Every antidote developed represents triumph of human ingenuity and compassion. The work continues, driven by the imperative to protect human life from chemical threats, while harnessing chemistry's benefits for health and well-being. The paradox at the heart of toxicology, that substances can be both poison and medicine depending on context, dose, and use, reflects a deeper truth about existence. Nothing is entirely safe or entirely dangerous in absolute terms. Risk and benefit must always be weighed against each other. What matters is understanding, respecting the power of chemical substances, using knowledge and caution to minimize harm while maximizing benefit, and maintaining systems to detect and respond to problems when they occur. From Mithridates, experiments to modern precision medicine, from ancient theriac to molecularly targeted antidotes, the progression reflects accumulation of knowledge, refinement of methods, and growing sophistication in our relationship with the chemical world. Ironically, thalidomide has found new medical uses decades after being banned. It's effective in treating certain complications of leprosy and has become an important medication for multiple myeloma, a blood cancer. Its use is now heavily regulated, with strict programs to prevent any possibility of pregnancy in women taking the drug. Patients must be counseled extensively, agree to use multiple forms of contraception, and undergo regular pregnancy testing. Male patients must also use contraception as thalidomide can be present in semen. The safeguards illustrate how even extremely dangerous drugs can be used safely when proper precautions are in place, and when the benefits clearly outweigh the risks in carefully selected patient populations. The field of clinical toxicology, the medical specialty concerned with treating poisoned patients, has developed remarkably sophisticated approaches. Poison control centers, which emerged in the 1950s, provide crucial services. Staffed by specially trained pharmacists, nurses, and physicians, these centers offer real-time consultation about poisoning exposures. Someone who has ingested something potentially toxic can call for immediate advice on whether emergency care is needed or whether home observation is appropriate. The centers maintain extensive databases on toxic substances, their effects, and management strategies. They can provide guidance to healthcare providers treating unusual or complicated poisonings. The data they collect contributes to poisoning surveillance and research. Medical toxicologists, physicians with specialized training in toxicology, manage the most complex poisoning cases. They understand the pharmacology and kinetics of thousands of substances, know how to use antidotes optimally, and can anticipate and manage complications. They're familiar with techniques like enhanced elimination, using methods like urinary alkalinization or multiple dose activated charcoal to speed removal of certain toxins. They know when extracorporeal elimination, removing toxins through dialysis or hemoperfusion, is indicated and which poisons are amenable to these techniques. Their expertise can make the difference between recovery and death in severe poisonings. Activated charcoal deserves special mention as a nearly universal binder for many ingested poisons. Prepared from organic materials like coconut shells or wood, activated charcoal has an extremely high surface area due to millions of tiny pores. This surface area allows it to absorb, physically bind to its surface, a wide variety of chemicals. Given shortly after ingestion of many poisons, activated charcoal can trap toxins in the gastrointestinal tract before they're absorbed into the bloodstream. The bound toxins pass harmlessly through the digestive system and are eliminated in stool. The effectiveness is highly time-dependent, as charcoal can only bind toxins still in the stomach or intestines. Once a substance has been absorbed, charcoal is useless. For some poisons, particularly those that undergo enterohepatic recirculation, where they're secreted into the intestines in bile and then reabsorbed, multiple doses of activated charcoal can continue providing benefit even hours after ingestion. Activated charcoal doesn't work for everything. It doesn't effectively bind alcohols, strong acids or alkalis, simple ions like lithium or iron salts, or certain other substances. It also has potential complications. If a poisoned person is drowsy or vomiting, there's risk of aspirating charcoal into the lungs, which can cause severe pneumonitis. In patients with decreased or absent bowel sounds, charcoal could potentially cause or worsen bowel obstruction. These risks must be weighed against potential benefits. When appropriate, though, activated charcoal is a simple, relatively safe intervention that can significantly reduce poison absorption. Gastric lavage, pumping the stomach, was once routine for poisoning cases, but has fallen out of favor. The procedure involves inserting a large tube through the mouth or nose into the stomach, then repeatedly instilling and suctioning out fluid to wash out stomach contents. It's unpleasant, carries risks including perforation of the esophagus or stomach, and evidence suggests it rarely improves outcomes compared to activated charcoal alone, especially if done more than an hour after ingestion. Current guidelines recommend gastric lavage only in very specific circumstances, such as life-threatening poisoning presenting within an hour of ingestion, and only when the potential benefit clearly outweighs the risks. Whole bowel irrigation, using large volumes of polyethylene glycol electrolyte solution to mechanically flush the entire gastrointestinal tract, is occasionally used for certain poisonings. It's most useful for sustained release medications that might continue releasing drug over many hours. For substances that don't bind well to activated charcoal like iron tablets or lithium pills, and for drug packets swallowed by body packers attempting to smuggle drugs by concealing them internally. The person drinks or receives through a nasogastric tube liters of solution until rectal effluent runs clear. It's an intensive, unpleasant procedure, but can effectively remove toxins from the entire digestive tract when other methods won't work. Hemodialysis and hemoperfusion, extracorporeal techniques where blood is circulated through a machine to remove toxins, are reserved for specific severe poisonings. Hemodialysis, where blood passes through a membrane that selectively allows small molecules to pass into dialysate fluid, can remove certain poisons efficiently. It's most useful for substances that are small, water-soluble, not heavily protein-bound, and have a small volume of distribution, meaning they stay mainly in the bloodstream rather than distributing widely into tissues. Methanol, ethylene glycol, lithium, salicylates, and certain other poisons meet these criteria. Hemoperfusion, where blood passes through a cartridge containing activated charcoal or other adsorbent, can remove some substances that dialysis can't, but it's technically more challenging and less widely available. The concept of the golden hour in trauma care applies to some poisonings as well. The faster treatment begins, the better the outcome. For acetaminophen overdose, NAC should ideally start within 8 hours. For organophosphate poisoning, atropine and pralidoxim should begin immediately. For many poisonings, the first hour determines whether the patient will receive activated charcoal and other decontamination measures while they're still effective. Emergency medical services play crucial roles in this golden hour, recognizing poisoning, providing initial supportive care, and rapidly transporting patients to appropriate facilities. As you drift deeper now into sleep, let these stories settle into your mind. Let them remind you of the incredible complexity of the chemical world we inhabit, the fine balance between harm and healing, the ingenuity of those who have worked to protect human life from these invisible threats. The antidotes that exist today represent triumphs of medical science, each one a testament to years or decades of research, thousands of hours of laboratory work, countless clinical trials, all aimed at that singular goal of preventing death and suffering from poisoning. And yet, the work continues, because new poisons emerge, new challenges arise, and the quest to understand and counteract toxic substances remains as relevant today as it was when Mithridates first began his experiments over 2,000 years ago. So rest now, secure in, knowing that while dangers exist, so too do protections. Science has given us powerful tools to detect poisons, to understand their mechanisms, to develop specific antidotes, to support patients through poisonings when no antidote exists. The invisible killers can now be made visible. Their actions can be blocked. Their victims can be saved. This knowledge, hard-won over millennia, represents one of humanity's great achievements. Sleep peacefully now, with these stories woven into your dreams, these truths about life and death, and the remarkable chemistry that underlies both. If you've found this journey through the science of poison and antidotes fascinating, if you've appreciated learning about these substances that have shaped human history, medicine, and forensic science, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these deep, immersive explorations of topics that reveal the hidden complexity and beauty of the world around us. Share this with anyone who might find these stories as compelling as you did. There are so many more mysteries to explore together, so many more realms of knowledge to discover in that peaceful space between waking and dreaming. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with wonder.